wonderful. You can see how many participants, 130, 140, 150, 160. There we go.
Oh,
there we go.
Yes.
200, there we are. Well, when it tails off, then we will begin. I think it's just there now. Okay, good evening, everyone. Greetings from Peckham Rye for the 42nd Strand Group. My name's John Davis. I'm director of the Strand Group. It's my absolute great pleasure to once again introduce to the Strand Group Sir David Omand. David's been a great friend to the Strand Group, but also to its precursor, the Mile End Group. And if you take them both, we are at 151 events this evening, and David's, I think, headlined and spoken at more, but headlined 7, which with my maths puts that at about 5%. So he's got a season ticket, and we're absolutely delighted that he does. David, as we all know, is one of the great British experts on security and intelligence, having worked for a very long time at the Ministry of Defence and then boss of GCHQ, the Home Office, and then finishing his career in Whitehall as Security and Intelligence Coordinator. Tonight, we are launching his new book. There we go. There we go. Who's worked that one out? I think it's lovely. I wish they'd have done that with my book, I tell you. If I just, like here's one that I should have done earlier. There we go. Wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff. Wonderful stuff. How Spies Think. I've had the great pleasure of reading it over the past days. It's a rip-roaring read, and it's really something that will stay with me. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David, who's going to speak for about 30 minutes. And then we will hand it over to questions from the audience. So do send them in via chat, and we will select and get as many through. David, you're welcome, so welcome, as always.
John, thanks for the introduction. I'm delighted to be back talking to the Strand Group. I just look forward to the day when we can actually all meet live at King's College. I started thinking about this book after the Brexit referendum and the 2016 US presidential election. And I found I was getting increasingly cross at how the issues were being conveyed through social media. And I ended up wanting to send out what you might call a call to arms in favor of rational analysis to support decision-making and to oppose the rising tide of half-truths, emotional distortions that seek to persuade us online of what we ought to think and want, not to mention the downright falsehoods and deceptions that we were fed, and not just coming from Russia, aimed at widening divisions in society and increasingly setting us at each other's throats. Now, I am not naive. The public has always aimed off in traditional political debate for political swagger and exaggeration of the benefits of a policy. And we've always known that personal ambitions and rivalries are inseparable from the contest that's democratic politics. But we shouldn't have to suffer those who blur or even deny the very nature of a fact. We're now in a world where respecting the truth no longer seems as important as creating the desired emotional impact, what the Rand Corporation has called the spread of truth decay. I would like it to be true becomes, with constant social media repetition, it might be true, and that slides too easily into it's as good as true. Now, my book was more or less finished by the time COVID-19 hit us, but the question that I pose in the book, what do we need to know to take solid evidence-based decisions, has come back with a vengeance in the arguments between professionals and policymakers over how to manage the pandemic. Now, as you said, John, I used to run GCHQ. I spent 7 years as a member of Britain's Joint Intelligence Committee that since 1936 has been providing government with what it needs to know to inform national security decisions. Now, of course, analysts never have all the information they would like. Lesson number 1 in intelligence The first lesson in my book is that our knowledge of the world is always fragmentary, incomplete, and it is sometimes wrong. And that's true of the information we use when we make any kind of decision. But I've watched intelligence analysts over the years succeed in reaching good judgments, despite never having enough data. And we can all learn from their methods and acquire self-knowledge of our emotional needs for the outcome of a decision and the ways in which we're more likely to fall into error or be deceived. One way of approaching this is to think about having to make a big personal decision. It might be where to live or what job to apply for, or even whether to wear a mask in the street tomorrow, a decision that could have welfare consequences for others. And we have to bring together in our own head two different kinds of thinking. On the one hand, rational, dispassionate analysis of the situation we're in, and on the other, our emotionally driven ambitions for what we want to achieve by our choice, or what outcomes we might fear and wish to avoid. And both kinds of thought, the dispassionate and the passionate, the is and the values driven ought, need to be understood and brought together if we're going to make sound decisions. Bringing these types of thinking together has always been hard, but my thesis is that it's getting harder in the internet age. The rational is being squeezed out by the emotional. Now, what we find online cannot be assumed to be objective evidence. Instead, what comes up can be emotionally manipulative, contradictory, and as sadly we know, sometimes deliberately false information, and from more sources than ever. And that can distort our rational analysis, but also leach across to affect what we think we want to secure from the decision. And that's as true about preparing to make choices in the polling booth as it would be choices made on an online dating site. In the arena of national security, governments take great care to separate organizationally these two necessary types of thinking. We want the most impartial professional judgments possible, using all sources of information from the Joint Intelligence Committee, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, and other professional parts of government, such as today the SAGE Committee, the Scientific Committee, to guide those with the democratic mandate who have to take in the end the hard decisions. Now, philosophically, of course, all we can know comes from our own personal sensory inputs, and analysts cannot fully escape from their unconscious framing of issues, precisely because they are unconscious. But by understanding how they can fall into error, and by following the physician's Delphic command, first know yourself, analysts can reach a high standard of impartiality and truth-telling. We expect ministers and their policy advisors to take heed of such analysis, but then, of course, to apply their political belief systems to their actual decisions, drawing on their democratic mandate, whilst avoiding, we hope, the magical thinking that makes the wish father to the thought, as Shakespeare put it in Henry IV, Part 2. I remind us in the book why so much online content works at an emotional, not a rational level. It's the toxic combination of the inherent characteristics of the business model of the internet, combined with our very human psychological vulnerability when we're online. Algorithm-driven targeted advertising is what pays for the benefits we get free at the point of delivery. Our own personal digital data, our online searches, viewing, sharing, liking, spending is used to market stuff at us. The more outrageous the material, the more clicks it attracts, and the less it costs the originator. And it's now used to target politicized messages, quite precisely at us. We are targeted with the messages that the algorithms have revealed are most likely to trigger our emotional response, and probably without our realizing how we're being manipulated within our filter bubbles. The internet is thus shaping our reality. It's not just a reflection of it. And that's why, obviously, autocratic states like Russia and China can use their censored internets to try to control their populations. So, to come back to the question I posed at the beginning, what do we need to know to take solid evidence-based decisions? And let me start with the rational part of the analysis. There are, I suggest, 4 routes to using intelligence to reduce ignorance. And together they form what I've called the SEES model of intelligence. My experience has shown you have to give everything an acronym if you want people to remember it. So my acronym is SEES, S-E-E-S, providing 4 outputs to the decision maker: situational awareness, explanation, estimation, and strategic notice. And the first 4 chapters of the book look at each of these kinds of output in turn. So if we start with situational awareness, it comes from accessing data about what's happening on the ground or indeed in cyberspace, answering the sort of questions that start with what, when, and where. And obviously we need reliable, consistent situational awareness of what we face before we start arguing about what policy choices we may have over what to do about the situation. But as I said, the first of my 10 lessons in intelligence is that our knowledge of the world is always fragmentary, incomplete, and it's sometimes wrong. I'm very conscious that the British intelligence community has put significant effort into building systems to provide better situational awareness, particularly of the activities of malign actors, hostile autocrats, terrorists, narcotics and human traffickers, cyber and other international criminal gangs, all intent on doing things that will harm us and going to great lengths to prevent us knowing what they're up to. So secret intelligence is needed to steal their secrets. And the data points being sought include identities and biometrics, associates and networks, locations, movements, finances, vehicles, purchasing, internet usage, and much else. And these intelligence requirements are obviously on top of the less visible, but still important traditional demands for intelligence. If we think for a moment about COVID-19, we get presented daily with figures on the media for daily cases, but we get those figures by date when the test result is recorded, not the date when the sample is taken, which is actually what matters. We get hospital admissions numbers, but they don't include Scotland. We get deaths of those tested positive in the last 28 days from all causes. But we don't get alongside them the important figures of excess deaths compared with pre-COVID levels. Those trying to trace the contacts have no access to hotspot data because Google and Amazon refused, on their view of data privacy, to let their app record where you were when you were reported as near a reported COVID sufferer. So even in that case, after several months working on the data, it's very difficult still to get the right kind of situational awareness. Now, in the national security field, we've always known that having situational awareness really does matter, and every military commander knows that. One of the examples I use in the book is that of the Falklands crisis. Margaret Thatcher would have woken on the 2nd of April 1982 to discover a fait accompli, to her complete surprise, with Argentine forces in control of the Falklands and her own head on the political block, had it not been for GCHQ intercepts earlier in the week, revealing that an Argentine invasion force had set sail for Port Stanley. That enabled her to show resolve on that famous Saturday debate by having the task force announcement ready when the fact of the invasion became public, and that very probably saved her government. I describe in the book the moment when, in her room in the House of Commons, I showed her those 3 key GCHQ intercepts. I will not forget telephoning the duty commander in the Ministry of Defence later from her room to pass on the historic instruction to ready the fleet for sea. Now, the second lesson in intelligence is rather different. It is that facts need explaining. Facts, even well-attested facts, are capable of multiple interpretations. Every defense lawyer knows that. Was the fact the fingerprints of the accused were found on the bottle thrown at the police? Was that because he threw the bottle? Or was it just his old wine bottle that the mob picked up as they rushed past the recycling bin outside his house? Same fact, different interpretations. And explanation is therefore the second letter in C's. It's the second output of intelligence analysis to support good decisions, answering as objectively as possible questions about how and why. For example, why do we now think it was Russia that was responsible for the NotPetya cyber attack? How did it end up costing global business over $10 billion and nearly destroying the world's largest shipping company? Now, providing a sound evidence-based explanation involves methodically testing alternative hypotheses against the data. You look for the explanation with the least evidence against it, not necessarily the one with the most evidence in its favor. If you look hard enough, as was done in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, you can always find some evidence that appears to support an argument. And that, of course, is how conspiracy theories thrive. But it would only take one solid piece of contrary evidence to knock down an explanation. Explanation is hard. You need access to background knowledge, foreign language skills, history, geography, anthropology, psychology, current affairs, much else. And the explanation often boils down to assessing the motivation behind some observed act. For example, why does Russia use the illegal nerve agent Novichok as a murder weapon, given that its use points straight back to the Kremlin? Now, our emotional state of mind affects how we infer meaning. Imagine yourself, John, you're late at night, you're sitting in the last train from the airport in an empty carriage when a burly, unkempt man comes into the carriage, sits behind you and starts talking aggressively to himself, apparently threatening trouble. Those sense impressions are likely at first to trigger the thought, hey-ho, he's going to turn violent, and you start to estimate the distance to the door to the next carriage and where the emergency alarm is. Then you notice the tiny earphone he's wearing. You relax. Your mental map has flipped over and now provides a non-threatening explanation. What you heard was the simpler phenomenon of a very cross and tired man off a long flight making a mobile call to the car hire company that failed to pick him up. Now, what made you for a moment apprehensive of how events might turn out was the emotional color on your mental map that represented a kind of danger area. And that initial framing was almost certainly beyond conscious thought. It may have been triggered by memories of past situations, or perhaps you just watched a scary movie on your flight, such as Halloween. So if you have a sound evidence-based explanation, you can be more confident in moving on to estimate, a word analysts prefer to predict, since nobody has a crystal ball, to estimate how events may unfold on different assumptions, and to model how others might respond to our possible decisions. So the third lesson in intelligence is therefore that to estimate how things might turn out, you need a sound explanatory model, not just a lot of data. Otherwise, you fall into what philosophers would call the inductive fallacy. So estimates and modeling are the third component of C's, the E for estimate, needed to answer vital questions about what's likely to happen next if we do, or perhaps do not, adopt a particular policy or act in a particular way. So in COVID terms, what would be the likely effect of specific lockdown measures, say, against the disease? And our estimates of how events might unfold will depend on the adequacy of our situational awareness and the soundness of our explanation, and on assumptions we may have adopted about how key individuals, or indeed people in the street, are likely to behave. I, I use the example in the book of the Bosnian Serb army commander, General Mladic, known as the Butcher of Srebrenica. I was a member of the Joint Intelligence Committee as the MOD Deputy Undersecretary of State for Policy. And after the massacre at Srebrenica on the 11th of July, we had to try and estimate what was this man going to do next. And 2 weeks later, I was with Air Chief Marshal Paddy Hine, Commander-in-Chief of Strike Command, along with our American and French opposite numbers, on a secret visit to Serbia to meet Mladic in a villa outside Belgrade. And our mission was to warn Mladic that any further moves against the UN's safe areas would result in US, British, and French air power being unleashed on his forces, and crucially, to try and assess from his response whether he was likely to heed the warning. We had agreed the airmen would wear aviator sunglasses and leather bomber jackets to increase the sense of menace, and we had agreed we would not touch the hospitality, sweetmeats and slivovich we knew we would be offered, a refusal that would be bound to offend. Mladic, in fact, made it easy to assess his motivation. He got increasingly angry. He tore open his shirt with a cry of, "Kill me now if you must, but no foreign boot will desecrate the graves of my ancestors." And he read out his own handwritten account of the tribulations of the Serb people since their defeat at the hands of the Ottoman army in 1389 in the Battle of the Field of Blackbirds. And what this amounted to was a racist declaration that the Bosnian Muslims, or Turks as he insisted on calling them, had no right to be in his country, and he was determined to drive them out. So we flew back late at night from our mission, having reached our assessment that to stop his ethnic cleansing, nothing short of full-scale NATO intervention would do, which of course is what then happened, and Mladic is now serving a life sentence for crimes against humanity. So those three, the first 3 letters of C's, the situational awareness and the explanation and the estimation, is fine. The risk is, of course, that whilst you're busy focusing on that, something will come and hit you on the back of the head that you weren't expecting. So the 4th letter, the final S, is strategic notice of possible future challenges that might come and hit us, especially when we're preoccupied with whatever the current crisis happens to be. Strategic notice, it helps the military in procurement planning. It answers important questions of how could we best prepare for whatever might appear next, or even could we preempt this risk so that it never comes to test us. My favorite example of that is Francis Drake singeing the King of Spain's beard in Cadiz, burning the boats necessary for the invasion of England, which was being planned. Can you actually preempt the risk? Most of the information you need for strategic notice, in fact, you can get from open sources, but it may take sometimes sensitive intelligence to underpin it and confirm it. So the 4th lesson in intelligence is that with strategic notice, we don't have to be so surprised by surprise itself. The example I give in the book is of the 2010 eruption of the Icelandic volcano with the unpronounceable name, Eyjafjallajökull, I think is something like that. When this volcano blew its top, European aviation was immediately grounded on the precautionary principle, so nobody knew what size of ash particle it was safe to fly a modern jet through. Iceland had provided strategic notice that such an eruption was likely at some point and had asked, without success, for research to be carried out. The engine manufacturers took a week to do the tests. They judged it was safe, but by then the shutdown had cost over £1 billion and a week of chaos and confusion for passengers, all avoidable if the strategic notice had been used to take sensible precautions. And as we can see today in government, professional analysis and policy making are different domains that sometimes find it difficult to understand each other. The processes of analysis can seem abstract and remote from the media-dominated world of the politician, but policy can too often appear to be driven by magical thinking, believing that some grand objective will be obtained without checking that the real world mechanisms are on the ground capable of securing it. So those four analytical processes are conceptually distinct, at least conceptually. And when governments fail to act appropriately or in good time, it may well be because of different kinds of problems that tend to affect each one of those types of thinking. And the second part of the book delves into all of that and why, despite our best efforts, we can get it wrong, such as cognitive errors and groupthink and confirmation bias and so on, which is the fifth lesson in intelligence. It's our own demons that are most likely to mislead us. And there can be specific warning failures that fall into the cracks between adequate foreknowledge and appropriate precautionary action, hearing but not listening. And of course, the answer you get from the professionals does depend on their knowing the true motivation for the question being asked. The sixth lesson, I'll just say, won't take time on it, is that we're all susceptible to obsessive states of mind. We all need to understand why it is that conspiracy theories, as we see today with COVID, conspiracy theories are believed by many. My example in the book is actually the conspiratorial theories of James Jesus Angleton as chief of CIA counterintelligence and his followers like MI5's Peter Wright, believing that Harold Wilson was a Soviet agent and therefore that the MI5 Director General Roger Hollis and the Deputy Director General must also be Soviet agents because they must have covered it up, which led to their fantasy that the KGB had murdered Hugh Gaitskell to allow Wilson to become Prime Minister, which in their circular logic only went to show that Wilson must have been a Soviet agent all along, all of which has subsequently been conclusively demonstrated to be nonsense. And analysts have to remember too that in the intelligence business, there's always the risk of deliberate deception. So the seventh lesson is seeing is not always believing. You get manipulation, deception, and faking. And I use the example now well known of the Iraqi defector Curveball, whose intelligence passed to us and the Americans by the German BND led the Joint Intelligence Committee seriously astray on Saddam's biological warfare capability. And after the war, Curveball admitted that he'd made up the reports of mobile biological warfare factories to help push the US into invasion, precisely those mobile BW factories that Colin Powell had shown the United Nations in his famous presentation. The final three chapters in the book, I'll be brief here, and the corresponding three lessons apply the learning of the model to the digital age. The eighth lesson is really about negotiation and the value of being able to imagine yourself in the shoes of the person on the other side. The ninth lesson is about trustworthiness and how you create lasting partnerships. And the example I pick in the book there is the UK-US intelligence relationship. And the final 10th lesson is the reminder that the threats from subversion and sedition are now digital. So we do have to learn how to stay safe and sane online, and how we're going to protect our democracy in a digital world ruled by these emotional responses that do not take sufficient account of reason. So to conclude, Buddhists teach that there are 3 poisons that cripple the mind: anger, attachment, and ignorance. Emotions such as anger can blind us to what is true and what is false. Attachment to old ideas with which we feel comfortable can falsely reassure us that the world is predictable and blind us to threatening developments because the world has changed. And this is what causes us to be badly taken by surprise. But it's ignorance that is the most damaging mental poison. And the purpose of rational analysis, which I describe in the SEAS model, is to help reduce such ignorance, thereby enabling us to safeguard our future. I'll stop there, John.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So much in there. And I can see that there's a few questions coming in at the moment. I'd like to ask just a couple myself, just one up front and one at the end. You finished the book on an optimistic note. After pointing out so many problems, page after page of modern problems. Could you, I think that people would like to hear, well, what are your reasons to be cheerful?
In part, it's because I'm an incorrigible optimist. And therefore, that is arguing against myself, because that optimism tends to infect my analysis, and I have to be careful about that. But I can see some straws in the wind. The internet companies themselves, who for years, they stoutly maintained they simply controlled pipes, and what passed down the pipes was nothing to do with them. They've now begun to realize that what is passing down their pipes is extremely toxic in some cases, and they actually have not just a moral duty, but a legal duty to start looking at what is going through their pipes and dealing with it. And Twitter, for example, is now labeling some of President Trump's tweets. Facebook has taken tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pieces of COVID disinformation off their platform. So that's one straw in the wind. But I think more fundamentally, what gives me optimism is the effect of sunlight, that we are now beginning to understand how the magic of the internet, what is behind it. The online auctions that fill the web page you click on with advertising which is directed at you personally, because the machines know all about you, because they've been collecting this personal data and collating it and slotting you into a category along with others that all share, say, 100 characteristics. This revelation really came to most people after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But now you can see this is how it works. And it's a good thing, because it means that when you click, information that you're looking for is more likely to surface, because the machines already know from your past behavior what it is you're likely to be looking for. When I click 1984, it will probably come up with references to George Orwell's book. If somebody else were to click 1984, they would come up with a whole lot of historic things that happened in 1984, simply because other people would have different browsing histories. So we can see that the internet has that magical capability, which used properly is actually a benefit. And COVID has demonstrated, of course, that our social interactions are now mediated through the internet. And what a good thing. How would we have kept in touch with our closest others were it not for the power of the internet? So the fact that we're beginning to understand the bad things, where they come from, how they can be managed. And at the end of the book, I suggest that we start in the schools and we start teaching critical thinking to children at a young age. and take them through their own internet journey so that they become much more critical and aware of what it is that people are doing to them. And once you begin to realize that, a lot of this stuff loses its power. You know, it may have had a big impact, for example, in the Brexit referendum. If you held another referendum, would it have the same power? Probably not, because I think we can now see the machinations that took place.
Thank you. Okay, so let me move over to some of the attendee questions. First one from Martin Plout, who asks, how badly has the trust between the UK and USA been damaged by President Trump?
I don't, you have to be careful about using the word trust. It's quite a slippery word. I prefer the term trustworthiness. So if you were to look at the intelligence community or the defense community and say, is there still a high level of trustworthiness in the behavior of each towards the other? I would say it's undiminished. And if anything, it's been enhanced in the last few years. So the level of cooperation is higher than it's ever been. And trustworthiness comes from integrity, perceived integrity, actually seeing that promises are kept, that behaviors follow the pattern of what you say. So you can actually say at the professional level, trustworthiness is, we are still an extremely trustworthy partner. At the political level, and this is not unique to President Trump, we've been there before, if you remember Edward Heath's conflict with Kissinger over European policy. You can have ups and downs, or indeed the Suez, 1956 Suez crisis. You can have very serious disagreements about policy and approaches. But if you still maintain trustworthiness, now, President Trump can be erratic in the views he expresses on tweets, and that makes him harder to read. No doubt this is deliberate, but it makes him harder to read. Therefore, it's harder to ascribe trustworthiness to policy utterances that appear on Twitter. But that hasn't affected the underlying relationship between professionals.
Thank you. Okay, from Captain John Aitken of the Royal Navy, do we still need spies? Can secrets be kept in the digital interconnected world?
Well, it's two parts to that question, aren't there? Yeah, do we need them? Even if we have them, can they be effective? So let's sort of separate it out into those two components. Do we need them? Yes. And the reason we need them, I think, is very simple, because there are a large number of people out there who do deliberately mean us harm. And they will go to almost any lengths, including extremely violent lengths, to keep their intentions and their actions secret from us. So the only way you are going to get a glimpse into what they're up to, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about people smugglers or criminal gangs or terrorist groups or indeed autocrats, is secret intelligence. Second part of the question is it getting harder? In some ways, in some instances, yes, because in a digital world, it is much, much harder to deploy some of the traditional methods of human intelligence. It's not impossible, but it's more expensive, takes longer. You have to be more careful, and it will take more time. But the digital world also provides information about people as individuals, where they traveled to and from, how they communicated, where their money is stored. So, you know, being clever about the digital world can give intelligence which previously in the more traditional world, the analog world, would simply not have been possible to obtain. So it's swings and roundabouts. I think we do need to have spies, if you call them that, intelligence agencies, providing that missing dimension for policy making and military command. And there are ways of still providing it, but it will be different again in the future.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a two-part here from Andy Howard. First of all, he says he's looking forward to heading to Waterstones in Manchester tomorrow to pick up your book. So that's the first point.
Excellent.
Second point is, how do you feel about the prospect of analysts dealing with big data and automation? Is the amount of data too big for human cognition?
The answer must be yes, because the amount of data that is available, potentially available, is beyond any human comprehension. You've got 3 billion people on the planet with digital mobile devices, busy sending stuff to each other and communicating and logging onto websites and so on. So you do need clever filtering, and then you need to have the machine learning systems, the AI systems, which allow sensible questions to be posed to the data, particularly searching for particular kinds of patterns, or supplemented by human intelligence. So somebody is seen in an internet cafe in North Africa who is suspicious. Can you actually find out the IP address of the machine from which he was sending the message and the time? Can you cleverly search the likely global streams of data to pick out that kind of communication? And as we know from the work that was done for the and made public for the 2016 Investigatory Powers Act, a lot of this is possible. And increasingly, of course, we will have visual recognition systems, digitized, high-res cameras at borders. So there will be information which can be sifted and looked at. One of the most interesting areas, which I know the United States is investing in, is we have imagery of most of the planet in quite high resolution, both commercially available and from drones and satellites. There is more image available than any conceivable number of analysts could look at. Just, you would need millions of people to look at it, but you could have programs running over this data, which could say a particular farmhouse that was associated with a criminal group in the past, a 4x4 has been seen to turn up unexpectedly. That may be the start of an investigation which could have very serious consequences, important consequences. So digitization has to go hand in hand in the intelligence world with the clever development of AI. And it's all got to be done in a legal framework that gives the public reassurance that this is not going to interfere with our privacy rights as citizens. So it will be done in accordance with the Human Rights Act as it is done today. That's going to be quite tricky to fix in relation to, for example, police use of facial recognition systems, as we already see, but it will be done. I'm quite confident about that.
Okay. Now, I presume that this is Professor John Gearson, one of your colleagues in war studies. I presume so. Thank you for a fantastic talk. Your S equals strategic notice, but how do we achieve strategic confidence between decision makers and their spies?
Well, the first thing, again, it comes back, doesn't it, to trustworthiness. So are the senior spies, if you like to call them that, the chiefs of the intelligence agencies, the senior officials there, are they acting in ways that over time demonstrate trustworthiness? The information that they provide, the integrity shines through, it's not distorted, it's not aimed to please. It's not aimed to make a point. I sometimes talk about the one or two ministers in the past that I've come across who, for them, the policy making, I'll give you the policy, you go and find me the evidence to support it. So evidence-based policy. We all know that that is not evidence-based policy, and you need to look at the negatives as well as the positives. This is the point I was making about inductive error. But the intelligence agencies are in a very privileged and special position, and they have to demonstrate that trustworthiness. At the same time, the politicians and senior officials have to demonstrate to the intelligence community trustworthiness going the other way, that they're not going to let individuals swing in the wind when occasionally you get an error, or occasionally the media stumble across some and put it on the front page. So that sort of, it's mutual confidence and mutual support based on a fairly open relationship. That I think the UK, we're extremely fortunate in having that kind of relationship. And if you look across Europe, you will find some countries where that relationship of trust simply has not existed, and there is mutual suspicion. And that's a very bad situation to be in. We're not there. We're not in that position.
Another one of your old colleagues, Tim Dowse, this
yes.
time from government, on the issue of strategic notice. Given that political leaders are rarely focused on threats beyond the next election, who should have the responsibility of scanning the horizon for the unknown unknowns? Might think tanks and academics be better placed to do this than Whitehall officials and bodies like the Joint Intelligence Committee?
One of the points I was making in my remarks is that most of the information you need to get a handle on some of these strategic long-term over-the-horizon risks is available from open sources. You've got the whole world of science and technology. You've got things like climate change. You've got the evident growing tension between the United States and China. You don't need secret intelligence to produce a good analysis of some of that. I think the important thing is that those on the inside are prepared to reach out to have dialogue with those on the outside, in particular the academic community, this sort of outreach. And this happens much more today than it did when I first started to get involved in these sort of activities, because it is quite likely to be the think tanks or the academics that have begun to realize that some development far off in the future could come and be a problem. But you still need somebody, and I think perhaps it is the Joint Intelligence Committee, to take the time to think about what would be the implications were this event, development or whatever, to come to fruition. They can focus on national security, others could focus on other parts of national life, and chief scientists are very good at doing that. But if you think about COVID-19, COVID-19 has killed more of our fellow citizens, done more damage to our economy than any conceivable terrorist incident or hacking incident could have done. The national security implications, for example, maintaining the deterrent, keeping our armed forces operational, despite the fact the supply chains have all been disrupted as people have to shield and all of that, the huge disruption all of that has caused. These are direct national security interests. So a paper or a briefing by those on the inside, drawing on the knowledge of those on the outside, is what I would, I think, recommend. We sort of already have mechanisms to do that, but I personally think we ought to be thinking about drawing closer together in adjoining rooms, if you like, those who are looking at the natural hazards that might affect our security, and those whose professional job is to look at national security intelligence, and put those two in adjoining rooms, and you might begin to get a better handle on some of the other things that might come and hit us.
Thank you. An old friend of the Strand Group, Sean Finnan from the Commercial Computer World, asks, if the internet companies now have to police what is in their pipes, why should we be confident that their truth is any more correct?
I don't think we can be confident of that. So you have to keep testing it. It's trust but verify, as President Reagan used to say. So we will judge by their actions. There are going to be hard cases, and there already have been, where freedom of speech bumps up against protection of the public. We have different laws over what can be said in public, or indeed passed through the social media, than the United States does. And they tend to be a bit tougher on the freedom of expression side of it. If you go to Germany, you get a much tougher view, for example, on anti-Semitic speech. So we all make these, each society decides what it is that it really wishes to protect the public from. There's, I think, universal agreement that child abuse is a bad thing. And the internet companies have been driven to look very carefully with AI algorithms at whether child abusive images are coming down their pipes. The reason, of course, they've done that is not just because they would say they are being socially responsible, but because advertisers have formed up to them and said, we are not prepared to place advertisements on your platform if there's a risk that our advertisement is going to appear next to some abusive image, because that will trash our reputation. And a number of big companies have really applied leverage. So, the Facebooks of this world are now employing thousands of people checking out a lot of that material. But you can't stop there being hard cases at the margin. And sometimes the companies will decide to suppress something that basically probably doesn't need suppressing, and vice versa. But as long as most of it gets suppressed, that really ought to be, then we're in a better position than simply saying, no, there's nobody policing this particular domain.
Next question from Julian Hooper. Thank you for the talk. I look forward to reading the book. What's your assessment of the importance of encryption for privacy, cybersecurity, and intelligence?
This is one of those questions where the answer has changed in the course of my working lifetime. From encryption is necessary, obviously, for national secrets, but you don't want it to get out of that domain into general use, because it makes law enforcement and military activity and so on harder. That has changed. Encryption is now fundamental to the working of the internet, because of the financial transactions that are carried by the internet internationally, and domestically our use of the internet for purchasing. And if there is doubt about the security of those communications, we're in deep trouble, because we've sold our soul to the internet. Our future economic and social life is completely dependent on the internet working and being trusted. So encryption has to be strong. And that poses this awful problem for intelligence and law enforcement. What happens when you seize the suspect's iPhone and you believe that on it is terrorist-related material, but you can't get in it because it's securely encrypted? There are no fully satisfactory solution to that has been found. Sometimes it can be opened. Sometimes there are loopholes that have been left by other apps on the phone. Sometimes you can get at it through the cloud with the cooperation of the company, even if you can't hack into the phone. A long-term solution will have to be worked out. Personally, I rather favor split key solutions. I know some of my old colleagues don't think this is workable, but a split key where you have half of the key in the chip itself, so it can't be meddled with, hard baked in the chip, and the other half is held by a trusted party. And with the production of a court order from a court that is accepted as a court of record, then you would get the two halves of the key and you could put them together if you had the device, but that would only open one device. It wouldn't open everybody else's device. So that's the kind of thinking that needs to go, well, is going on, I know, but actually turning an idea like that into a practical reality that doesn't cost too much money would be a major, major task. So this is still work in progress. And if anyone listening, some of the King's postgrads and so on, if they've come up with a really clever idea, then I think the Home Office would be delighted to hear from them.
Well, one such postgraduate asked a question, Harry Bloodworth, who asks, with regard to the growing potential for a no-deal Brexit, what impact do you see this having on the European security community, and how worrying is it for Britain specifically?
Very good question, timely question. Personally, I would divide security community into two parts. If we have in mind operational cooperation between the British intelligence agencies and their European counterparts, mostly bilateral, but sometimes trilateral, then it will make no difference. And that would include most of the counterterrorism work, which is conducted through the Strand Group outside the European Union. And these bilateral relationships are valuable to both parties on either side of the channel, and will continue. I've no doubt whatever about that. And they're not governed by the EU, because Article 4.2 of the European Treaty explicitly says national security is a matter for national governments. It's not an EU competence. The other half of national security is law enforcement. And law enforcement is a European competence, which is why you have the Schengen information systems, you have Europol, you have the PRUMS Convention, where granular data about suspects, including DNA, vehicle licenses, criminal records, all of that is available at a tap of a key to Schengen members and at the moment to the United Kingdom, because we've signed the necessary agreements, overseen by the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. The UK's government's view, you can't possibly have the European Court of Justice overseeing anything in the future, means that at the moment there seems to be an impasse where we can't get access to that kind of information after the end of the year. We would need some new legal instrument. I just hope and pray that the negotiators somewhere are busy working up an EU-UK security treaty or some legal vehicle which would allow that sharing to continue. The same is true of things of counter-narcotics information, where there are specialist counter-narcotics bureaus. Again, part of the EU competence, we contribute a lot to those, and they help us, particularly in relation to new synthetic drugs. If we are cut off, as in theory we would be, certainly by a no deal, but also by, if we haven't got another agreement, parallel agreement to put in place, then we will suffer, and so will our European partners. So on the law enforcement side, I am very concerned. So far, there's been radio silence from government about what is going on, if anything, on that front. And we'll have to wait till the end of the year and see if they've then magically produce some agreement which allows us to continue to contribute. When you talk to professionals across Europe in their law enforcement and intelligence community, they all say we must continue to have this level of granular level of cooperation with the UK. The UK needs it, they need it. At a political level, it's difficult to see quite how you fix that if we are insistent on our conditions for not be allowing these arrangements to be subject to the jurisdiction of the ECJ.
Thank you.
So a mixed answer.
We are running out of time, but I just want to ask a few more questions.
I'll give quicker answers.
Don't you worry, they're fine. First one from Strand Group member, Dr. Michelle Clement, who asks, what one change would improve decision-making in government today?
All right, let me have a punt at that. Safe spaces. If we could be assured there were safe spaces where the senior politicians, not their special advisors, but the senior politicians themselves and their senior professional advisors, senior civil servants, scientists, intelligence community, whatever, could meet and they were talking truths to each other. And because there were no witnesses, people didn't have to pretend. They didn't have to posture on either side, particularly if views change and you could actually get drill down to, well, if that's really what you want to do, Minister, this is what it will take to do it. This is how long it will take to do it. And if you really, if we have confidence that you understand that, we'll do it. Too often, I think we've slipped into partly busyness and all the rest of it, into really not having a deep enough exchange. And it can be painful on both sides, because the official side will have to realize that some of the advice they've given perhaps wasn't quite as good as they thought it was, or the management of the subsequent actions weren't as efficient. And the ministers will have to recognize that sometimes they've been guilty of magical thinking and announcing things without really being sure how on earth they were ever going to be implemented.
There seems to be quite a few students online, and it's possible that you are inspiring them. And so there's a question which I think in different ways several people have asked, which is what training would you advise to pursue a career in intelligence and security?
It doesn't really matter what initial formation you have. If you've got the right kind of mind and the right kind of personal characteristics to be able to work in teams, to be able to lead teams, then the technical knowledge you need, you will pick up very, very quickly. Heretical view perhaps, but given what we've been talking about, John, about the importance in the digital age of really understanding how all this stuff works, one of the bits of preparation I advise when I get the chance is just make sure you do understand all of this stuff. It takes a bit of hard work. There's some quite difficult books you've probably got to read in order to understand, because then you become an intelligent customer. I'm not suggesting people go off and learn to write abstruse code and so on, but you have to be an intelligent customer. One of the reasons GCHQ is so successful is even if you enter, whether first in history or mods and greats or whatever it might be, within 6 months, you are expected to master the digital domain. And clever, intelligent people can do that. The tragedy is that in civil government, to express that rather broadly, the level of competence of being an intelligent customer is not as high as it needs to be.
Lovely, thank you. And a last point is that there seems to be quite a bit of discussion online about the painting behind you. And I think that the most specific answer is Robert Walpole or a contemporary, 1720 to 1740.
Bit earlier, about 20 years earlier. Admiral Sir George Rooke, the man who captured Gibraltar. It's Studio of Kneller. It's not really a Kneller, but it's a Geoffrey Kneller. But it says on the bottom Studio of, so it's that period. But he captured Gibraltar leading an Anglo-Dutch fleet, which is quite an interesting thought. About 1702.
There we are. There we are. Okay, that brings us to an end. The next one we've got, a Strand Group webinar, is next week, actually, when Kieran Martin, newly appointed visiting professor at King's, but recently retired, first head of the National Cybersecurity Centre, will give a first lecture for King's on cyber weapons are called viruses for a reason. Statecraft security and safety in the digital age. Seems to me to bookend this one very nicely.
Yeah, if I can, John, I'll just say that I've heard Kieran talk on this subject. It's a must attend. It will be very interesting. It will be quite controversial.
There we are. But before I go, can I say, well, I think it's been great. We've had nearly 300 attendees. The book is published tomorrow. I think it's a stocking filler, actually. It's coming up to Christmas. Thank you so much, and see you all again soon. Thank you, David.
Thank you, John.